We know more than anything that what's reported today can become foreign policy tomorrow. And fundamentally what's at stake is Israel's safety and the Jewish people's safety.
Well, welcome to the podcast today. My name is Jeff, and I'll be your host. And today our guest is Mike Fegelman. He's the Executive Director of HonestReporting Canada. Honest Reporting is an independent grassroots organization promoting fairness and accuracy in Canadian media coverage of Israel and the Middle East. Welcome to the show, Mike.
It's my pleasure. Jeff, thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you on here. And this is something that I just think is so needed in the media space today, especially. And we want to find out a little bit more about you, a little bit more about Honest Reporting and what it's all about. When was it founded and why?
Sure. Honest Reporting Canada started in 2003. This is, bookended between the first and second Intifada, when the media coverage of Israel was deplorable. Israel was maligned in the headlines, on broadcast, on the internet, depicted in the most unfair, inaccurate, unbalanced manner. And there were some people in the UK who were very frustrated, who, quite frankly, just took out their computer and were writing letters frantically at the media saying, you're just not giving Israel a fair shake. This is biased. There is no objectivity in your coverage. We want change. We want professional standards of journalism to be adhered to. And it started off like that, a grassroots effort, not a professional organization, people who were concerned, who didn't want to pass the buck, who wanted to take ownership, to do what they could for Israel. And it then blossomed into an actual professional organization that grew from just a couple hundred members to, we have about 50,000 subscribers from coast to coast throughout Canada. And they're our eyes and ears. They're the people who identify media bias and then work to confront it and to counter it. How we do that is many and varied. We engage with the media, we file complaints, we deal with professional journalism associations, ombudsmen. When necessary, we will resort to having a grassroots response where people complain en masse. Other times it's just through dialogue. But fundamentally, we're not blanket apologists for Israel. Israel will make mistakes, but we want the media to do a professional, reasonable job in covering these issues, because we know more than anything that what's reported today can become foreign policy tomorrow. And fundamentally what's at stake is Israel's safety and the Jewish people's safety in the nation of Israel.
Yeah, that's right. Now, Mike, tell us a little bit about you. What's your background and how do you come to a role like this with Honest Reporting Canada?
Yeah, my background is in journalism. It has always been my passion. I've been an editor and a reporter for various media outlets throughout Canada. And actually, at the start of my career, I didn't know a lot about Israel. And I didn't know a lot about Judaism. I didn't know a lot about Jewish ancestral claims to the Holy Land. But I found I had a newfound passion to Israel. And I was able to merge my talents with journalism and my newfound passion with Israel. And actually, I came to Honest Reporting originally as a volunteer. I was walking in Jerusalem and I saw a sign in the garbage that said, "Help fight media bias against Israel, join Honest Reporting." And I contacted the local office, said I'd be happy to volunteer, and was hired the next day as one of the founding directors. And it's been a wild ride. We've come across some of the most egregious violations of journalistic standards. We've come across blood libels. We've come across real blatant Jew hatred. It is, I can tell you, it is incredibly toxic. This past May, with the conflict with Hamas, the 11-day war, we saw a torrent of abuse against Israel, whether on the traditional legacy media or in the realm of social media, where it was just you're really fanning the flames of hatred.
Wow. Now, just clarify for me. You said you saw a sign in the garbage?
I did.
Did I hear that wrong?
Not that I'm a garbage picker. But, maybe there was serendipity, right? I mean, I just happened to have seen it. Maybe there was a bit of divine intervention. Maybe that's how I'll refer to it. And because I had never heard of Honest Reporting. And I contacted the organization and found out that there were some prominent people here in Toronto who were looking to start a Canadian chapter. So our remit is dealing with Canadian media, whether print, broadcast, electronic, English, French language, academic, alternative, campus media, anything and everything. We digest everything that the Canadian media produces 24/7. It takes a Herculean effort to do it, and we monitor the content. And I should say that added layer of editorial oversight that we provide to the media is greatly appreciated by our newsmakers in a world of cutbacks where they don't have that editorial oversight. So, some people might think that the relationship is antagonistic. It's actually quite cooperative and complementary because they realize that we're helping them do their jobs.
That's really good to hear. And you said the very next day you were hired. Is that right?
That's right. That's my story. So let that be a message to anybody who volunteers. There's a genesis to everything. There are birth pains to everything. And, I'm a firm believer that if you love your job, you don't work a day in your life. And I've never felt I've had a job, but I love what I do with a fiery passion. And I know what's at stake. So I take it very seriously.
Now, from your long experience in this field, would you say that the Canadian media are generally balanced in the way that they represent the Israel-Palestinian conflict?
No, I wouldn't say they're balanced. And that is our challenge. Balance, listen, it's not, although you may strive for balance and it's not a simple one-for-one, the biggest challenge with the Canadian media is not necessarily what is covered. It's more what isn't covered. When we talk about the broader Middle East, what ends up happening is there's a magnifying glass put on Israel. Anything Israel does, right or wrong, is framed in this negative light. There is the highest concentration of journalists in Israel and Jerusalem versus the broader Middle East. And why is that? I think you can always imagine. To report in Syria, to report in Iran, you might be thrown in the Edmund prison. To report in Afghanistan, it's absolutely terrifying with the Taliban taking hold. And what ends up happening is, foreign correspondents, Western journalists are able to cover the post of the broader Middle East from Jerusalem, from the comfort of the David Citadel Hotel, and without fear of reprisal or censorship or any of that effect. And they're able to do that. But you don't hear about, the gender apartheid that exists in the broader Middle East. You don't hear about the lack of fundamental freedoms that regular, everyday Muslim and Arab citizens cry for. And it really does an injustice to these people who, it stymies their quest towards self-determination because we're not hearing a full representation of what's happening in the broader Middle East. Other things, the safety issue it's very real. If you go to the Gaza Strip, you're going to have Hamas goons who are going to follow you, who are going to tell you, or Hezbollah in Lebanon, who are going to tell you, you can cover this, you cannot cover this. So there is a very serious and cynical manipulation of journalists to the point where there isn't a free society; it's a fear society, and that really only bolsters autocratic dictatorships and terrorist entities. So there isn't balance. It's a challenge.
When I sit and watch my newscast when something is going on in Israel, I know because I follow so many sort of Israel media outlets and email distribution lists. I know what's happening. There could be 400 rockets sent into Gaza in a day, but the headline that day will be something like Israel bombs Hamas targets in response to rockets fired or something to this effect. Why is this disproportionate criticism of Israel such a thing?
Well, let's start with the issue of the rocket fire, right? Israelis, whether you're in Sderot or whether you're in Ashkelon, sort of the coastal cities, the ones that are within closest proximity to the Gaza Strip, they're enduring rocket roulette. They have been enduring that for decades. You think about how Israel pulled out, disengaged in 2005, removed 8,500 settlers, and removed all of its settlements, 21 of them, and its entire armed forces. And what did it get in return? It got a forward operating base of terrorists who were launching, deadly rockets at the Jewish state. This past May, in an 11-day war, 4,000 rockets were fired. So, one issue I have with journalists is, I'll say, how come we're not hearing about that this is a daily occurrence, that Israelis are under threat, that Palestinian terrorists are committing war crimes, like firing on civilians while hiding behind civilians, and they'll tell me, well, like you said, what's news in that? And they use the word new within news because it's a daily occurrence, and just because it is such a regular thing and not an anomaly, that doesn't mean that there's no news value to it. So that's a bit of an issue that we have to sensitize our journalists that, because terror is a daily occurrence, you can't ignore it, and you can't just frame it when Israel responds to it and retaliates. It's not like as if this incident happened only when Israel took retaliatory measures. So it's a challenge in the way the media frame it. It positions Israel as the aggressor and not as acting in self-defense. And it's not a surprise that the namesake of Israel's armed forces is Israel Defense Forces, not Israel Offensive Forces. Israel never initiates a conflict. It just tries to thwart and deter terrorism. But it's happening. It's happening across Israel's every border on a daily occurrence, whether it's different stabbing attacks, whether it's kamikaze suicide attacks where terrorists are taking vehicles to try to run over Israelis, whether it's suicide bombings, sniper attacks. There is no end. We're seeing more innovative tactics like arson balloons that are launched from the Gaza Strip in an attempt to incinerate bordering Israeli communities. Israel, it has to do everything in its power. It has a requirement to safeguard its populace. But this is what's happening. And then those are on the more, tactical kind of threats. And then you go to the more strategic and existential threats when you think of Syria always having the potential to have biological and chemical warfare, the potential to deploy that at Israel. There was a rocket that was launched from Syria a couple of weeks ago. And then you think about the existential threat against Israel through Iran. It's never been a more perilous and dangerous time for Israel. And we've seen recent IAEA reports that say that Iran may have enough uranium water enrichment to procure a bomb in the next month. This is Israel's backyard. And I find that it's rather cavalier of our news media, who will opine and dictate what Israel can and should do from the comfort of their homes in Toronto and Brampton and elsewhere, until you have skin in the game. And they just don't have that skin in the game. They just don't know the terrain. They don't know the players. It's that naivete that we deal with.
Yeah, wow. It's difficult to understand. Listening to you talk and knowing the truth about the situation in Israel, it's difficult to understand why it is that the Human Rights Watch, for example, is so critical of Israel, accusing them of war crimes. Is this balanced? Is there any truth to these kind of accusations?
Not at all. And of course, Israel strenuously objects to those characterizations. And, fundamentally, the definition of anti-Semitism holds that when you hold Israel to a double standard and criticize it unlike any other nation in the world, then you're singling Israel up for a program. And I cannot find Human Rights Watch criticizing other countries in the same caliber, in the same way as it does with Israel. And that's just Human Rights Watch. If you go to a body like the United Nations and you look at the General Assembly, which disproportionately singles out Israel while letting serial human rights offending nations and pariah nations like North Korea, Syria, Venezuela from carrying out atrocities, and you don't hear there are no emergency sessions, there's no condemnation. It's just the Jewish state, as if it's committing horrible atrocities. I'll give you an example. Just about, I think it was 2 weeks ago, the Americans had launched a drone strike which killed 10, I believe, Afghani civilians. Right? Can you imagine if that happened with Israel? You can imagine that this would be on the front page of the Globe and Mail. It'd be on CBC The National, it'd be on CTV National News. The headlines would blare. But because it's the Americans, and maybe there's a different standard that the Americans are held to versus Israel, that there isn't that kind of outrage. And listen, if Israel makes mistakes, it should be criticized. I'm not saying that it shouldn't, but you have to hold it to the very same standard. Quite frankly, what we deal with is Israel's demonized. It's held to the double standard, and it's delegitimized. What other nation has to defend its own legitimacy that it can be a Jewish state when there's an avowed effort to push things like the quote unquote right of return, things that call for Palestinians to really assert a demographic ticking bomb to take over the Jewish state and change the Jewish character of the state, just rendering it another Arab country. Why can't there be a Jewish state? There's a Christian state. There's how many dozens of Muslim and Arab states? What's wrong with the one Jewish state? What's wrong with the state of Israel? Why is that so problematic?
Yeah. That kind of brings up another subject, and this whole accusation of apartheid. I mean, what happened in South Africa was horrible, and this characterization of apartheid and apartheid state in Israel. Talk a little bit about that and why it's so, in my mind, ridiculous.
Yeah, it's farcical, and it's a libel. It's a canard designed to make Israel look like it's committing human rights atrocities. But the reality is the comparison. There's no analogy. If you go to Israel, if you live there, you see regular, everyday Muslims and Arabs who thrive in Israel. They are at the pinnacle of Israeli society, whether it's sitting on the Supreme Court, whether it's being titans in business and sciences and medicine. They're afforded equal rights before the law, and you look at the current government, which has an Arab party within it, the Ram political party, and the comparison to South Africa is so flawed because in South Africa you had a white minority ruling over the black majority, and here you have an Israeli Jewish minority that has equal status of the minority 20% Arab population in Israel. And it's just the tragedy is I think people digest the headline without doing their due diligence, without really going a layer deeper, and it's just really meant to paint this negative picture of Israel and give it a black stain. But there's no substance to it, and anyone who goes to Israel or does the very, very bare minimum of research will see that it's just a libel.
Yeah. Lately, COVID-19 has brought about some other situations, anti-Israel misinformation about, Israel hoarding vaccines and refusing to vaccinate those living under the Palestinian Authority has been reported in news media outlets around the world, including here in Canada. What's the truth about this situation? Can you kind of help clear that up for us?
Sure. So listen, in every time of great uncertainty, people will always seek the scapegoat. And, whether you go back to the time of the Black Plague, where Jews were blamed at that time, hoarding the virus, manufacturing and creating it, or in some way standing to benefit from it. We see the modern reincarnation of that libel, which is happening here, where the state of Israel, whether it's different Canadian politicians who are making the claim, or whether it's different anti-Israel detractors who are usurping media outlets to make the claim that Israel's, taking all of the vaccines and not giving them to their neighbors, or again somehow manufactured the disease. Again, no substance to it, and on the issue of providing vaccines, for example, to the Palestinians, Israel said at the very get-go that it wanted to support the Palestinians by getting them as many vaccines, not just through the equitable sharing structure, but because it knows Israel has a porous border, and on top of the humanitarian concerns, it knows that there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who work inside Israel. So it also stands their best interest to have Palestinians vaccinated, and they've given hundreds of thousands of vials. So whereas I can't think of other countries who have. Right? So Israel's held to that unfair, unreasonable standard, and a lot of the times it's done by people who have really nefarious agendas. They have that toxic agenda to want to malign Israel, to want to malign the Jewish people. Why? Whether they're closeted or overt bigots, that is their raison d'etre.
These conversations always sort of get me a little bit riled up and even angry. It's just so difficult to understand this anti-Israel bias that we face in our world. But of course, we know that anti-Semitism has been a reality for hundreds of years, and is kind of resurging, it seems, in this current season. We talked a little bit about last May, the rocket fire from Gaza, the conflict that occurred during that time, and you mentioned that it was, sort of one of the heaviest times of anti-Semitic pressure, both in media and social media, some of those kind of things. We were actually targeted at that time. I would say that in the space of a week, we probably received multiple thousands of anti-Semitic messages on our posts in social media, to the point where I took our page down actually for 3 or 4 days just to try and get a handle on all of that. Outside of the Israeli consulate in Toronto in May, we had people, screaming, "Israel will fall, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." What goes on in people's minds, and why is it that the general population here in Canada seems to not fully understand the severity of these kinds of protests and these kind of statements?
Yeah, so I'll focus on social media, which I view as a sewer. It is a sewer for everything that you don't want to see in society, where you have vitriolic hate that is posted, that goes viral. Our biggest concern with the hate that is online is that it could transcend into real world violence. That people could see that kind of messaging and be motivated to actually go into a synagogue, to go into a church, and shoot it up. And we've seen that before, and we know history tells us that can happen. That's why our big push is on the regulatory side of things with social media platforms, to try to really thwart the kind of hate that exists there. There will always be bigots. There were bigots 100 years ago, and whether they had pamphlets that they would hand out to their community, this is just a different manifestation of it, which tragically and very dangerously has a reach in the billions and an unfettered reach. Whereas yesterday's bigots, could only publish to a small audience. Now, anti-Semites can have access to millions and millions of people. So we're pushing for Facebook, for Twitter, for Instagram, that they can't just outsource these kind of comments and just say, you guys, lay people, have to police this. They have to work on it. They have to change their algorithms, which feed on that negative kind of hostility that breeds it, because they know that kind of content has more click-throughs. It has more of a stickiness factor to keep people on the platform, but it's not healthy. Why are Jews in Canada the number one victims of hate crimes? We think a lot of it has to do with the kind of feeding frenzy that happens online and in these different platforms. And to hear that your Facebook page was targeted is not a surprise. We're a target all the time. And it takes a lot of time to have to purge the hateful kind of commentary. Things that we see that really run afoul are, Israel compared to Nazi Germany. Claims that the Gaza Strip is the Warsaw Ghetto. Things that are to the very definition of anti-Semitism that should not have a platform but do. And the funny thing is, you report it to the different platforms, and oftentimes things that are clear incitement to violence and hatred, they will say are legitimate commentary. So we know we have a real issue with the platforms. We can work to flag individual responses, but we know that there are billions of posts and billions of users, and somebody who's removed will create a new profile. It's kind of like whack-a-mole. But we can't just let it go on unfettered, and that's a big part of what our organization does. Is we flag these instances of real hateful commentary and try to get them removed, because we know the consequences. They're very real.
That's great insight, and I want to. Maybe I'm going to go down a bit of a rabbit trail here, but this comparison to Nazi Germany, this has been bothering me lately, and maybe you have an opinion on this, maybe you don't, but I'm just going to throw it out there. Lately, I've been hearing a lot of people talk about some of the regulations due to COVID-19, due to this health pandemic that we are experiencing. and comparing, government restriction to what happened in Nazi Germany and what happened in the Holocaust. Does this not minimize what happened to millions of Jews in the Holocaust? Is this even a good analogy?
I don't even see how there can even be a basis for an analogy. Irrespective of your stand on vaccine passports or on vaccines, all of those measures are being undertaken, to save lives. The Holocaust was an effort to annihilate the Jewish people, to stigmatize it, to put Jews through concentration camps, to really commit a genocide of religious people. In what way is the protocols and different efforts that people are undertaking to address COVID in any way analogous? I don't see how it's relevant for people to make that analogy, and for people at anti-vax or anti-vax passport protests to adorn things like the yellow star. It's a real insult to the Jewish people, and it's pure historical revisionism. It's really dangerous, and it cheapens what the Holocaust was, which was the systemic murder of a people. It pains me to see it here in Toronto, throughout Canada, throughout the world.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I'm glad to hear you say that. It just every time I see a post that makes that comparison, I respond, because I just think, people, you obviously have no idea what happened in the Holocaust, because there's just nothing even remotely similar. I'm all for personal rights and freedoms. I'm not sure, that I even fully agree with vaccination passports. I think that if the vaccine is effective and does what it's supposed to do, then it's those who are unvaccinated that are at the most risk. But we all sort of have our opinions on some of those kind of things, but to make that comparison just drives me crazy.
It drives me crazy. It's like the kind of virtue signaling that has really taken a hold, where people they're making these comments because for whatever reason they want their megaphone, they want their platform, but they don't see the consequences. They don't see that people are being singled out and a genocide is being cheapened to score political points.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, really. Amplified ignorance, I call it, and social media has given everybody that megaphone, and it's not always a positive thing.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it can be a double-edged. I look at social media like a double-edged sword. We know the negatives. I also see the potential for a lot of positives. As an organization, what we want more than anything is for people not to pass the buck and to stand Israel in the high esteem that it deserves. And there's always a great opportunity to do that in social media. The challenge is when, you get into those kind of shouting matches, which are counterproductive and don't help. But for people to take, 5 minutes out of their week to advocate for Israel, that's the very least that they can do, and it can make inroads.
Yeah. That's good, and I want to talk about that in just a second. But there are a number of anti-Semitic messages that seem to have been picked up and normalized almost by the mainstream media. Why is this happening? And can you give us some examples of some of those? It's so important that they don't become normalized or accepted. And so just talk a little bit about that.
So I'll give you an example of something that we reported on just yesterday. And you can go to our website, www.honestreporting.ca, to see it. There was a professor at Sheridan College, his name is Professor Andrew Mitrovica, who wrote a piece on Al Jazeera aligning Israel with mafia hitmen, claiming that Israel is child murderers of Palestinians and that they are inhuman and diseased. Now, he's saying this of the Israel Defense Forces, and what probably most people may or may not know is that in Israel, it's a conscripted army, meaning that anybody above 18 years old is required to serve in Israel's armed forces. Men, women, you can have an exemption if you're not of the Jewish faith. But basically what this individual wrote was that, Israeli Jews, writ large, are a diseased people. And according to the definition of anti-Semitism, when you dehumanize a people, that is Jew hatred. And we've seen this before. We've seen it from Goebbels in the Third Reich. We've seen it in Nazi Germany. We've seen it in Rwanda that led to the genocide between the Tutsi and the Hutus. We've seen it in Serbia. When you describe people as really, quite frankly, vermin, it gives an inclination to exterminate that. And that's why we're really concerned, because here you have a professor at Sheridan College who teaches young and impressionable minds, mind you, a journalism professor who wrote this kind of really nasty libel. So what was this person's motivations? I have no idea, and quite frankly, I don't really care what's in that person's heart and mind. All I really care about is the kind of content that they're producing. But this is really concerning. It's one thing to see this, in the broader Arab world, where there is, an unfettered hate that exists in a lot of the media that exists there. But here you have an Ontario Canadian professor. I mean, it is Al Jazeera, but it's read everywhere. It's online. It's incredibly concerning, and I think the administration at Sheridan College is going to have to answer some serious questions, conduct an investigation, and consider what has to be done.
Mike, help me with this, because I'm not sure I know the answer. Do we have laws against hate speech in Canada?
Yes, we do. But the question is, how enforceable are hate speech laws? If you think about the number of hate crimes convictions that have happened in Canada, I can only think of a handful. Though I am proud to say and happy that in the past, about a year or so ago, there was a rag called Your Ward News, which was this anti-Semitic pamphlet that was handed out. That it was also misogynistic. It had the most gross caricatures of the Jewish people, and that the Attorney General did prosecute, and the proprietors, the publisher and editor, were convicted, which is great. But it was an anomaly. So oftentimes, real vitriolic hate and bigots, they get off because there is an inclination to prosecute. I think we live in a world where free speech should be defended with an absolutism. I'm a staunch free speech advocate, but we know that there are times when it crosses the line, where if you shout fire and encourages somebody to commit an attack, these are really challenging times, and I don't think we're seeing an appetite from the judicial sector to address this.
Yeah. And it's just, I guess, so difficult. The phrase I think of is like trying to pin Jello to a wall because of, what is the definition? What is the definition of hate speech? What constitutes hate speech? All of those kinds of things. And I was very pleased, to see. I think we heard that reporting through Avi Ben Lolo at the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Toronto, that that rag, that communication was closed down, and that was a great win for Israel, and the justice for the Jewish people, here in Canada and around the world.
I wouldn't want any of your viewers to think that this is an effort of censorship. Far from it. Anybody can write and say whatever they want.
No.
Just don't cross the line into hate. You can. I have no problem with people criticizing Israel. Do it as much as you want. You cross the line into hate, and you lend credence to the feeding frenzy. It'll motivate people to commit attacks, and the same is said for any other faith community who where we allow bigots to have a platform unimpeded.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We chatted with a gentleman from Israel back a few months ago, and his stance is this. He said, I can have a dialogue with anybody, but if at the beginning of the dialogue you tell me that your goal is to kill me, probably we're not going to have a very good conversation. He says I can converse with you as long as that's not on the table. And I think that this stated purpose of the Palestinians, that Israel be annihilated is kind of problematic for dialogue most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, it can't be the starting point, right? like where do you go from there? You
No.
use the words, the chant, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. We hear this all the time. Listen, we hear this in the streets of LA and New York, where you have leftist protesters who are using that chant without realizing that fundamentally that's a call for the land to be Judenrein, to be Jew-free. By the way, you go to the Gaza Strip. How many Jews are in the Gaza Strip? There are, I think, 2 now. Why are they there? Because they're being held captive by Hamas. There are no Jews in the Palestinian territories. Let's talk about that apartheid. This is, nobody really wants to have, the media don't want to have an appetite and an interest in those kind of stories. But why? That's a real story. If we want to talk about a world of liberal values, of tolerance and peace and equal rights, why can't Jews exist in a future Palestinian state? Why must it be Judenrein? And why is it a method of statecraft to consider, the intolerance of a Jewish state as part of a terrorist agenda? Why is that socially acceptable? How can that be a modus operandi?
Yeah, all very, very good points. And it can't be. It can't be. It has to. If it's going to be inclusive, it has to include everyone. And I think that you have just helped us to understand a lot more about that today. Now, as a Christian, I follow the words of the Bible. The prophet Isaiah in the Bible says, "For Zion's sake, I will not be silent, and for Jerusalem's sake, I will not remain quiet. I have posted watchmen on your walls, Jerusalem, and they will never be silent, day or night." I think it's Isaiah 62. Now, do you relate the work that you do with this verse at all? Do you feel that there's any kind of spiritual significance in what it is you're doing through honest reporting?
Yeah, I do. And I'll quote Deuteronomy in saying, justice, justice, and you shall seek. That is what we're here for. We're here to shed a light on the truth, to provide veracity to the situation, because we know what's reported today can become foreign policy tomorrow. I consider the role that I'm doing to be holy work. And I think that every one of our subscribers and people out there who advocate for Israel in every possible way with whatever skill or means that they have is doing holy work.
That's awesome. Mike, it's been so great to have you on the show today. And I want to just ask you to say one last thing, for people that are watching or people that are listening, who, wonder how can I advocate for Israel? What is it that I can do? Just tell them how they can get involved in what you're doing, or how they can be helpful, or what are some other things that they can do even outside of the work that you do?
The first thing I'll say is I want everybody here to be well informed about the issues, because if you really want to advocate for Israel, you have to understand it. You also have to have that passion for it. So get informed, be media literate, read as many sources as possible, and then make a commitment. I don't know what it might be. I don't know what your skills are. I don't know what your time constraints are. But let's just say this. If you can take 5 minutes out of your week to have a conversation with one person about Israel, to maybe cause a paradigm shift in the way they think about the Jewish state, or maybe it's just posting on your social media channels, just do it. Don't pass the buck. Don't have an expectation that somebody else will do it. We have to roll up our sleeves and get involved. We know the stakes have never, ever been higher. And that's what I'd want people to do, to be involved as a grassroots person, be Honest Reporting Canada's eyes and ears. If you spot something that is especially problematic, but quite frankly, if you're not sure if something is either innocuous or egregious, contact us, call us, email us, flag it back to us. We're here to help educate you. We're here to help articulate any of your grievances. We're here to help you do whatever you can to advocate for Israel. So consider us as a resource.
Wonderful. And your website again?
www.honestreporting.ca.
Well, thank you, Mike. Again, it's been just great to have you on the podcast today. I feel like I have learned a lot, and a bit of a kindred spirit. Of course, we both are very passionate about advocating on behalf of Israel. And First Century Foundations, we're a Christian charity, and we do assist a number of humanitarian and other organizations in the land of Israel. And so it's very important to us that people understand that Israel is that it's here to stay, and that they have a right to live in the land where they live and to be able to defend themselves. And I think that those are all key things. And we're pro people. We're not anti anything. Not anti-Palestinian and pro-Israel. We're pro-Israel. We're pro-Palestinian as far as the people go. But we are not for the evil that gets propagated under this incredible regime. And so just appreciate today your insight, and want to say thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Jeff, it's an honor. It's a huge privilege for me, and thank you for the opportunity.
Israel came out of Egypt. They came out as an army.
But how much of it can be proven archaeologically?
Available now from First Century Foundations, the powerful documentary series Miraculous Victories of Israel.
The enemies of Israel gives unequivocal proof of the actual events.
See how God's promises to His people have helped them survive and conquer through perilous times, from Abraham to today.
Seemingly small against super big, against all odds.
It's miraculous that a nation can survive 2,000 years without a home under the worst conditions.
To order your digital download or DVD copy, go to miraculousvictories.com today.